She found the letter on a Tuesday morning, tacked beneath a silver tray of cold, untouched tea, and from the moment her eyes traced those ink-dark words, Miss Elara Whitmore understood with terrible certainty that her life, as she had known it, was irrevocably over. "You will accept his proposal, Elara, or you will leave this house with nothing but the gown upon your back." Her stepfather's handwriting, sharp, merciless, as cold and unfeeling as the man himself. Elara stood in the draughty corridor of Whitmore Hall, the letter trembling between her fingers, the autumn wind pressing through the cracked windowpane beside her and threading its chill across the back of her neck like a warning. She was 22 years of age, penniless and utterly alone in a world that had very little patience for either condition. And the man she was being commanded to marry? His Grace, Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Ravenswood. A man whose countenance, they said, could silence an entire ballroom. A man who had not smiled, not genuinely, not warmly, since the death of his young Duchess 4 years prior. A man who needed an heir, who needed a wife, and who, by all accounts, needed nothing so inconvenient as love. But before we follow Elara down that cold corridor and into the most momentous decision of her young life, if you are new to this channel, welcome to the Duke's Lost Letters. I pour my entire heart into every story told here, and if tales of stolen glances, scandalous secrets, and unexpected love speak to your soul, I would be so deeply grateful if you would take just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That single gesture truly means everything to the growth of this little corner of the world we are building together. Now ring that notification bell so you never miss a single story. And now, let us return to Elara. She had not slept the night before her introduction to the Duke. She had lain rigid beneath the threadbare coverlet of her small bedchamber, rehearsing words she could not find and swallowing fears she could not name. The fire in the hearth had long since died to grey ash, and still she lay there in the dark, listening to the house settle and creak around her like an old man sighing in his sleep. What did one say to a duke who did not want a wife, but required one? What did one say to a man who was purchasing a companion as one might purchase a piece of fine furniture, for its utility, its placement in a room, its ability to fulfill a singular practical function? The carriage arrived at 9:30 the following morning. It bore the Ravenswood crest upon its polished black door, a raven in flight above a silver crown. And Elara watched it from the upstairs window with her gloved hands clasped so tightly together that the seams ached. She wore her best morning dress, a pale blue muslin that her late mother had always said brought out the grey-green of her eyes. It was not fashionable, it was not grand, but it was hers, and she wore it with the dignity of a woman who had very little left to call her own. Her stepfather, Lord Whitmore, received the Duke in the front parlour. Elara was summoned down the stairs like a parcel waiting to be inspected. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ravenswood, was not what she had imagined. She had anticipated coldness, yes, she had anticipated the imperious bearing, the severity of expression that all the whispered rumours at Almack's had promised. What she had not anticipated was the way his dark eyes moved across her face when she entered the room, not with calculation, not with the measuring gaze of a man assessing livestock, but with something far quieter, something that looked briefly and painfully like recognition. As though he too had spent a sleepless night, as though he too had arrived at this arrangement not through desire, but through the slow suffocation of circumstance. He rose from his chair. He was tall, considerably taller than she had supposed, and there was a contained, deliberate quality to every movement he made, as though he had long since learned to hold himself still, lest something within him break. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man entirely unaccustomed to being questioned. "Your Grace," she replied, and her own voice, to her considerable relief, did not waver. Lord Whitmore beamed from his chair beside the cold fireplace, all appetite and self-congratulation, and launched at once into the terms he had so eagerly negotiated. Edmund Ashford did not look at Lord Whitmore. He looked, with disconcerting steadiness, at Elara. And after a long moment, after what felt to her like an eternity suspended between one heartbeat and the next, he said simply, "Would you walk with me, Miss Whitmore, in the garden, if it please you? I find I prefer to conduct my most important conversations without an audience." The garden of Whitmore Hall was a sad, neglected thing, overgrown box hedges and rose bushes gone to thorns, gravel paths choked with the copper debris of fallen leaves. A thin November sun pressed weakly through the clouds above them, offering light without warmth, illuminating the world without truly touching it. They walked in silence for a time. Elara kept her gaze forward, her hands folded before her, acutely aware of the precise and proper distance between her arm and his, the distance of propriety, of strangers, of two people who had not yet earned the right to stand closer. It was the Duke who spoke first. "I will not dissemble, Miss Whitmore. You deserve plain speaking, and I intend to offer it to you." He paused, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I require a duchess. Ravenswood requires an heir. These are not romantic considerations, and I will not dress them as such. What I can offer you is security, a home, independence within the bounds of our arrangement, and my solemn word that I will never be cruel to you." Elara turned to look at him then, and what she saw in that strong, grave profile, the faint tension about his jaw, the deliberate steadiness of a man bracing himself against something he could not quite name, undid her carefully rehearsed composure far more thoroughly than any cruelty might have done. "And in return," she asked quietly. "Your name beside mine, your presence at Ravenswood, and your patience," he said, "with a man who has, I am told, rather forgotten how to be in company." And before we continue into the darkest chapter of their story, dear listener, if you have not yet subscribed to the Duke's Lost Letters, please do so now. Every subscription, every like tells me that these stories matter to you, and that knowledge is what keeps this channel alive. Tap that subscribe button now, and let us carry on. They were married on a pewter-grey morning in December in the small chapel at Ravenswood Estate, with no guests beyond the necessary witnesses, and no flowers save for a single spray of winter jasmine that someone, she never learned who, had left upon the altar. The Duke's ancestral seat was everything Whitmore Hall was not: grand, immaculately kept, its corridors stretched on like whispered sentences, lined with oil portraits of Ashfords long departed, and every room breathed with the accumulated dignity of centuries. And yet, for all its grandeur, Ravenswood was profoundly, achingly quiet. Elara felt the silence like a presence. In the weeks that followed, she and the Duke maintained a careful, courteous distance. They dined together each evening in the vast formal dining room, the candlelight clustering between them across an expanse of mahogany and silver, and they spoke of the estate, of the tenants, of books they had read, and opinions they held with measured, exploratory caution, like two creatures approaching a flame, uncertain whether it would warm them or burn. It was the library that undid them both. She had discovered it on her third day at Ravenswood, a soaring cathedral-like room on the second floor, its shelves climbing from floor to ceiling, its tall windows looking out over the frost-silvered park below. She had gone there in the small hours of a restless night, wrapping herself in a heavy woolen shawl and carrying her tallow candle through the sleeping house, and she had not expected to find the Duke already there. He sat in the great leather chair beside the hearth, a book open in his lap, a glass of brandy untouched upon the table beside him. He was not reading, he was staring into the fire with an expression of such unguarded, undefended sorrow that Elara stopped in the doorway as though she had walked into a wall. He looked up, their eyes met across the cold, book-shadowed room. Neither of them spoke for a very long moment.
"I could not sleep," she said at last, because silence, she had found, could only be endured for so long before it became a kind of falsehood. "Nor I," he replied, and then, after a beat, "There is room enough here for 2 insomniacs, Miss—" He stopped, corrected himself. "Elara." Her given name in his mouth was an entirely new thing. It arrived quietly, almost tentatively, and yet it landed with the weight of a declaration. She felt the warmth of it move through her chest, like the first breath of spring through a house that had been shut all winter. She came and sat in the chair across from him. The fire crackled. The candle she carried cast its small, wavering light across her face. Outside, the Ravenswood grounds lay silent beneath their mantle of frost, and the whole vast sleeping world seemed very far away. "You grieve her still," Elara said softly, and it was not a question. His jaw tightened. For a moment she feared she had transgressed beyond forgiveness, but then, slowly, he exhaled. "I grieve what we never were. That is perhaps the hardest kind of mourning, not for what was lost, but for what was never permitted to exist." And there it was, the first true thing he had ever said to her, unpolished and unguarded, offered in the small hours beside a dying fire, in a library that smelled of old leather and cold stone, and the particular, sacred silence of a house in which something was finally beginning to thaw. The scandal arrived, as all scandals do, without invitation and without mercy. It came in the form of a woman, Lady Cecilia Vane, a widow of impeccable beauty and deeply questionable character, who appeared at Ravenswood Estate one frost-brittle afternoon in January, arriving with a small trunk, a letter of considerable legal weight, and the announcement that she carried the Duke's child. Elara heard the news from her lady's maid, who had heard it from the housekeeper, who had overheard it in the entrance hall, with the absolute conviction of someone who understood that extraordinary information, once received, cannot be kept. Elara sat very still at her dressing table, her brush suspended mid-stroke, and felt the floor beneath her shift as though Ravenswood itself were recoiling. She had not known, could not have known, and yet the cold, mechanical part of her mind that had survived on practicality for 22 years began at once to calculate her position. If the child was legitimate, if some prior entanglement, some secret betrothal, some scandalous arrangement she had not been privy to held legal standing, then her own marriage, her own fragile, tentative, blossoming position at Ravenswood was nothing, a convenience, a stopgap, a mistake. She was halfway down the corridor towards the Duke's study when she heard his voice through the closed door, low, controlled, but carrying the precise clipped cadence of a man exerting enormous restraint. "You will leave this house, Cecilia, today, and you will not return. Edmund, the child is not mine. We both know this, and you will not use an innocent life as a weapon to extract what you want from me, not again." Elara stood in the corridor. She did not move. She breathed, and she listened to the silence that followed, the long, loaded silence of a woman calculating whether the game was lost. It was. Lady Vane departed within the hour. Dear listener, if you are still with us, still breathing in the cold corridors of Ravenswood alongside Elara, please take a moment now, if you have not already, to subscribe to the Duke's Lost Letters. Your support is the very reason these stories exist, and I am so grateful for every single soul who chooses to listen. Now, let us carry on. The Duke found Elara in the library that evening. Of course he did. It had become, in the quiet weeks of their strange and careful marriage, something of a hallowed ground between them. She was sitting in her chair now, the one she had claimed without asking, and that he had never once reclaimed. She was not reading. She was not pretending to read. She was simply sitting with her hands in her lap, watching the fire, and when he entered the room, she looked up with the grey-green eyes that he had been thinking about, he realized, with increasing frequency and considerable alarm, for several weeks. "You heard," he said. "Enough," she replied. He stood for a moment in the doorway, then he crossed the room and sat across from her, as that first night of her insomnia, and he leant forward with his elbows upon his knees and looked at her with that unguarded expression she had only seen him wear in this room at this hour when the rest of the world had retired and left them to themselves. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. Our arrangement—" "Edmund," he interrupted, and he said it in the same tone she had used his name for, low, unhurried, weighted with something that neither of them had yet found the correct word for. "Please, call me Edmund." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Edmund. Lady Vane and I had an understanding 3 years ago, before your time. It was not honorable on my part. I was grieving and I was foolish, and she was opportunistic. It ended badly. I believed it was entirely concluded. I am sorry that her reappearance caused you any distress." Elara studied his face in the firelight, the gravity of it, the earnestness, and felt something inside her chest loosen with slow, painful relief, like a fist unclenching. "It did," she said, with an honesty that surprised even herself. "Not because of the arrangement, but because—" she hesitated, steadied herself. "Because I find, to my considerable inconvenience, that I have ceased to think of this as merely an arrangement." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full to the very brim. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ravenswood, reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, gently, carefully, with the particular reverence of a man handling something precious that he had not yet earned the right to hold, and said, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the crackling of the fire, "I have not either." And in that draughty, candlelit library, with the frost pressing against the tall, dark windows, and the portraits of all those vanished Ashfords watching from the walls, something that had begun as a transaction, cold and calculated, and entirely without sentiment, became at last the truest and most ardent thing that either of them had ever known. Ravenswood, for the first time in 4 long years, felt like a home. Thank you so much for listening to this story on the Duke's Lost Letters. If this episode moved you, if you felt even a fraction of what Elara and Edmund felt
in that firelit library, please leave a like, share this story with someone who loves historical romance, and subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so. Every single one of you is the reason I keep writing. Until next time, may all your love stories, however inconvenient their beginnings, find the most beautiful of endings.